meeting of December 12th. I'd just like to remind everyone, in accordance with open meeting law, please be advised that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast over Lunenburg Public Access. So I have 7 o'clock, and Jason is the only one absent. In terms of communication, do we have any public comment before we begin the meeting this evening? Seeing none, I would just like to remind folks that we'll be having another meeting of the Finance Committee a week from tonight, December 19th, same time, 7 o'clock p.m. right here in Town Hall. And the purpose is to hold a public hearing on the special town meeting warrant. As everyone knows, we have a school building project on the warrant for this year. And since that has budget implications for the town, we'll be holding a public hearing to hear the merits of that. So I would encourage people to come out. We will be broadcasting that meeting as well. Any public or communications from the committee?
No, none.
Okay. I do have a most recent issue of the Beacon.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to start our meeting this evening with the town manager's financial forecast presentation. Every year, the town manager updates the 5-year financial forecast, and we have Kerry with us this evening to present that.
Thank you and good evening. For the presentation this evening, there are 4 handouts. There is a copy of the financial forecast, a copy of the presentation that I'll be going through this evening, and then I do listen to you. A couple of the slides that are difficult to read, I printed in full size, so hopefully they'll be easier to look at. So this is exciting because we have a couple of new Finance Committee members who haven't heard this presentation, and it gets tough doing the same thing year after year to the same people. So I'm excited we have a couple of new people this year. And I thought my clicker was working. It's not working, so I'm going to be moving around a lot. But the financial forecast that we put together is a 5-year forecast, and it's really the first step in the annual budgeting process. But there are specific reasons why we forecast. We do so because of it's part of best management practices. That's one of the reasons why we forecast. We also prepare the forecast because it's something that's required by our town charter. So it's important for us to be following the rules and regulations of the town. And thirdly, it's important to forecast because bond rating agencies look favorably upon communities that forecast. And over the last 4 to 6 weeks or so, we've had some really great news regarding both of our bond ratings. And I really do believe it's because we forecast, because we've continuously put money in our stabilization fund, because we're not using our stabilization fund for operating purposes, that the rating agencies looked at that and felt that we were worthy of, sure, that would be great, of increases in our rating. And there's obviously a difference between forecasting and budgeting. So for forecasting, we're looking at a long-term comprehensive strategy versus budgeting where we're looking at something on an annual basis. Next, please. No. That's one back, please. So there are some key concepts in forecasting. First, that these are all projections. They're not anything that can't be altered. And once you put a model together, you certainly can easily change that. So there are a lot of assumptions that go into this. But when you forecast, there is an assumption that if you see a problem, you're going to do something to fix that problem. We have to balance our budget on an annual basis. As I'm sure you're aware, there are some governmental entities that aren't required to balance their budget. But at a local level, are not required to balance their budget in any particular period of time. We have to have a balanced budget by our annual town meeting for the following fiscal year. So it's not like we can't, we can go into a year with an unbalanced budget. That would be a very unusual occasion. Sometimes things happen between town meeting and the beginning of the fiscal year, or town meeting and when we set our tax rate, that cause our budget to be unbalanced. And we have to take additional actions to rebalance the budget. But we do have to balance the budget. So that's for the first year, but then there are 4 other years in the forecast, and anybody who's seen the forecast, at this point, the first year is unbalanced. But certainly in the outer years, we tend to see bigger and bigger deficits. So there is an assumption that change is going to be made, whether that change is to raise revenues, to come up with additional revenues, or to make cuts, or to change the way that you do business. So it's, it is a tool. Next slide, please. So there are a number of things that guide the forecast in addition to the assumptions that we make. We have to be mindful of any requirements of Mass General Law. We have, and I'll go into that in a little, why don't we actually just go to the next slide rather than this one. So in terms of Mass General Law, we have laws that govern a bunch of different things that affect us locally. Employee benefits, health insurance, those things are in some part governed by Mass General Law. There are certain laws that require the delivery of service. We're required to provide education. Believe it or not, we're required to provide a Board of Health. We're not required to provide a police department or a fire department or DPW. So it's interesting what state law requires and what it doesn't require. But we do have to be mindful of that. We also have town bylaws in the town charter that require certain things. So we have to make sure that any of those requirements are incorporated into the financial forecast. There are also, if you go to, actually, no, let me just finish with this. Nope, this is not the next. This, no. That's okay. Okay, so I guess that's where you were. Then we also have financial policies of the town that we have to adhere to. And as you have been working on the last few months, obviously you're very familiar, probably the board most familiar with the financial policies of the town. We have financial policies that talk about our operating budget, our capital budget, stabilization fund, and the like. So we have to be mindful of those as well. There's also another report that I've put together in the past, and it's probably time to officially issue that again, and that's the trends analysis. I did that for a few years. It's something that I maintain as an internal document, but we haven't circulated. But what this is the forecast looks ahead. A trends analysis will look back either 5 or 10 years and kind of see where we've been, and that is a very useful tool as well in forecasting. Especially here, we've made some pretty significant cuts in services over the last few years, so it would be interesting to see if that trends analysis is showing anything different than it did in the past. Next. Another set of documents that we have to be mindful of when we're putting the forecast together are any collective bargaining agreements that we have with employees, because those are contracts and we need to be able to fund any financial requirements of those contracts. Next, please. So when we look at assumptions that we make for the financial forecast, we're looking at service levels. We want to be mindful of the level of service that we provide now. We want to take into account any changes in the level of service that we may need to make because of changing demographics or an increased demand for something. We also have to look at the local economy. We have a significant portion of our budget that comes from local receipts. We have to look at the state budget. That plays a significant part in our financial forecast as well. We have to look at the cost of services, and that's becoming more and more important as resources are tighter. We need to be making sure that we're providing the service in the most cost-effective manner, that we're outsourcing services that can be provided more cost-effective by a private source, and to strike that balance. So in the financial forecast document itself, there is a detailed list of assumptions. I will go through most of those and be happy to take questions on those if you have questions. We'll skip over this one, actually. So in looking at the forecast, we have assumptions based on revenue and assumptions for expenditures. I think that the thing that I struggled with in putting this together was going into it, I had a sense that I thought our revenue picture would look better than it does because we're past the deficit. We're into the recovery, and I had a sense that things would look better than they did. So that was something that I struggled with for a while. And in terms of our local receipts, we never did that bad. Our motor vehicle excise tax went up every year, and it went up at least by 3 and 4%, and some years higher than that. And in talking to people in other towns, they were seeing flat motor vehicle excise or decreasing motor vehicle excise. We never saw that. During the last several years, we had a significant amount of building in the community with the 2 very large residential projects with Tri-Town Landing and Emerald Place. So we didn't see a significant decrease in our building permit receipts. Because of that, we also saw additional tax revenue. Our new growth was never that bad. And now that we're on the other side of that, we don't have, more can be built at Tri-Town Landing, but we don't have, the developer hasn't applied for the next building, and that's a project that developer is receiving funding through the state. So that's an unknown. We don't know if that's going to go forward, and we're really at the end of Emerald Place. We have an awful lot of residential units that have been approved through the various 40Bs, but we don't have anybody who's ready to go at this point in time, and that's a good and a bad. I think maybe people have had enough of 40B type development in town, but from a financial perspective, it brings in new growth, it brings in building permit receipts. So it's not all bad, but I'm not expecting any significant growth in local receipts because it didn't really fall off. And so I think we will see about the same level of growth. I'm actually projecting no growth in local receipts in fiscal 15, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And one is related to health insurance. We received a reimbursement from the federal government for providing retiree prescription drug coverage. And one of the changes that we made through our plan design change with health insurance last year was to move retirees to Medicare and the Medicare Part D. So we achieved a significant amount of savings as a result, probably close to 4 times what we brought in, but that money came in as a local receipt. We're not going to see that. So I'm projecting a very low increase in local receipts over the next several years. In terms of property tax, property tax goes up 2.5% per year. I do expect that we will see a lower amount of new growth in fiscal 15 and going forward. We will see a decrease in our exempt debt of about $120,000 over the life of this forecast. Most of our exempt debt will start to fall off outside of this period. We have some non-exempt debt falling off within this period, but the exempt debt is pretty consistent throughout the life. State aid, I will talk about in a little more detail in a minute. Available funds, I'm not projecting any use of the stabilization fund or free cash, with the caveat that I am recommending that we continue to maintain our stabilization fund at 5%. So as our operating budget goes up, so does the stabilization fund. So to the extent that we can fund that increase with free cash, that's how I would look to draw free cash. And then our enterprise operations, obviously, they pay for themselves, and they pay a little towards the general fund for the services that the general fund provides to the enterprise funds. But if you go to the next slide, I want to spend a few minutes talking about state aid. Yesterday, there was a joint legislative committee hearing on the consensus revenue estimates, and I had the opportunity to spend a couple of hours at the hearing. It was the first time I went to the hearing, and it was very interesting because there were several panels of speakers who came and spoke before this joint committee. So I had the opportunity to listen to the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue, the State Treasurer, the Assistant Treasurer for Debt Management, the Director of the Lottery, the Director of PARAC, which is the oversight agency for public retirement systems, PARAC's actuary, and there were several other speakers there. And everybody talked about the strong revenue picture at the state level, particularly in this year. Revenues coming in above benchmark, both for income tax and sales tax, and there were lots of caveats that they were talking about November in particular, that income tax receipts were much higher, and there were reasons for that, including people paying ahead. But they were still, when they were able to back out all of those things that seemed to be a one-time occurrence, they still felt, particularly the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue, that revenues were coming in the current fiscal year above benchmark. So that sounded good. They talked about the fact that Cyber Monday sales were up 21% over previous years. So that sounded good, and it was interesting because they talked about, whether or not is that really consumer confidence, or is it a pent-up demand for people buying things? Not particularly Cyber Monday, but just the increase in sales tax. People have gone for so many years tightening their belts and not spending, and is it really consumer confidence? They talked about the Amazon.com sales tax agreement and how that will have an impact in the current fiscal year for 7 months, because now sales on Amazon.com in Massachusetts are subject to sales tax. The state treasurer mentioned that lottery net profit for the lottery was up so much that the treasurer was going to revise his estimate for the current fiscal year by $20 million. The treasurer talked about the casino projects, the 4 projects, and didn't seem to be concerned about the impact of those projects on lottery sales. He mentioned that the state lottery generates 3 times the net profit that those 4 casino projects together are estimated to generate. Plus, they'll bring in about 15,000 jobs. So the treasurer was seemed to be very interested in those projects, didn't think it would be much, it would be competition for the lottery. He also talked about the fact that the stabilization fund in the Commonwealth is the third highest in the country, only second to Alaska and Texas, and those two states have opportunities that we will never have here. Assets. They have assets, natural resources that we'll never have here. The stabilization fund for the Commonwealth is $1.557 billion. And he talked about the fact that it needs to be higher. It needs to be higher than that because the state is concerned about its bond rating. The state, interestingly enough, has the same bond rating as the town of Lunenburg right now, AA+, one step below perfection. So it's the highest bond rating the state has ever had. And they're very interested in maintaining that rating. And they talked about the fact that because we don't have county government in Massachusetts, that it kind of skews the state's data in terms of, specifically in terms of long-term liabilities. So in other states that have county government, they have employees associated with county government, their pension liability might look different, or their OPEB, their retiree health insurance liability might look different. But because we don't have county government here and all of those employees are state employees, the state, from an outside perspective, looks like its long-term liabilities have a lower funding ratio than other states that carry that AA bond rating. So that's of particular concern to the state because it issues a lot of debt on an annual basis. So the state treasurer was very interested in being able to increase that stabilization fund. He also, and I thought this was really funny, talked about the fact that if Charles Dickens was alive today, he would write a story called A Tale of Two Commonwealths. And he talked about the fact, about the cuts that have been made at the state level, particularly in social services, mental health services, and that type of thing. And that's obviously a hot topic because the state has cut an awful lot over the years as well. And I think, if you're not using services that the state provides on a regular basis, or they're not things you're thinking of, you don't tend to remember all of the cuts that the state has made. So all of that good news about strong revenues above benchmark left me thinking that the state was probably more interested in taking care of itself this year than making increases to local aid, which was disappointing because the lottery, we've taken a significant cut in lottery. We've lost about 25% of our aid. We had part of that restored this fiscal year, but the current projection for lottery receipts for fiscal 15 is the same as fiscal 14. Mm-hmm. So that means we're not going to see an increase in that general government unrestricted aid, which I had hoped that we would start receiving some funding there. I do expect that we'll receive something in Chapter 70, and I have accounted for that. I put in the standard 25, I increased it by 1%, which is just a little bit more than $25 per student, which is what it used to be. In talking with the assistant director at the Mass Municipal Association, he felt that we would be looking at maybe between $25 and $75 per student increase. But it's just too early to tell. So the next slide. Overall, in terms of revenue right now, as I said, it is pretty modest. It averages out to about 2% per year. And one thing that I meant to point out with property tax, because we always talk about, we need to limit our growth to 2.5% because property taxes only go up 2.5%. But you have to keep in mind that's 2.5%. Property taxes go up 2.5%. property taxes is the largest part of our budget, but it's not all of our budget. So not all of our budget goes up 2.5%. Property taxes go up 2.5%. The next slide. Maybe before that, if I could stop for a minute if there are any questions about revenues, I'd be happy to take those now.
I do.
You have a question?
Yes, I do. On the excise tax, year to date, how does the revenue on the excise tax look as compared to budget? Because right now, there's a tremendous number of cars being sold, new cars being sold. There was a lot of pent-up demand. I would think that excise tax would reflect that to some degree.
Yeah. So several weeks ago, we presented the first quarter financial reports, and overall, I reported to you, and the town accountant reported as well, that our first quarter we didn't collect, we collected, I think, 23% of our annual revenues, which is very significant because the first quarter is slower in a lot of things, in particularly motor vehicle excise. Motor vehicle excise, we have one large commitment, and then during the course of the year, we have much smaller commitments. And that large commitment comes in February, so that's in the third quarter. So we don't ever see in the first and second quarter motor vehicle excise that is trending with whatever percentage of the year we've completed. For motor vehicle excise in the first quarter, we saw about what we typically see. Once we close this month, then I'll be able to provide you with the second quarter reports, and that'll be in time for when I have to put the final recommendation together, so I can give you a better idea. But I think last fiscal year we ended motor vehicle excise a little bit less than where we had budgeted, but it wasn't significant. And again, every year that I've been here, we've seen an increase in motor vehicle excise, while many communities haven't. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But it's really hard to make any firm projection on that until we have that commitment in February.
Something else?
No.
Carrie, could you just clarify on your revenue assumption? We're looking at an increase in the property tax of 2.5% each year. Mm-hmm. But overall, the revenue is averaging out to 2%?
Yes, and significantly less than that in fiscal 15. In fiscal 15, I'm looking at right now only about 0.6 of 1%. But that is... that will change once I hear more about what the state's doing. I think if I didn't go to that hearing yesterday, I know when I came back, I'm like, I think I need to make some adjustments here. It will go up, but I don't think it's going to go up significantly. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if our overall revenue increase without adding anything new, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things that we're looking at.
My point, though, is that despite a 2.5% increase in the property tax, the overall increase in revenue is 2% or less. The assumption is 2%.
Yeah, that's true.
May I follow up on that just a
Please.
bit? Historically, do our property taxes increase just 2.5%? My understanding is 2.5% is a baseline on which new construction, which I agree that probably isn't much, and renovation and additions of existing property boost that a little bit. So why do we limit the assumption of property tax increase to 2.5% going forward?
So if you look on, and I don't have the pages numbered, but if you look on the first few aren't, the third page, which is the revenue summary for the forecast. And the top section of that shows property tax. Oh, I was counting double-sided. So the third.
John, in the other handout,
Oh,
the,
Oh, in the forecast document
Ah.
itself, yeah.
no wonder I'm lost.
So if you look at that top section, that's the property tax calculation. And it is the existing tax base that we calculate the 2.5% off of. And then we add in new growth, and then we add in, if we had any overrides or debt exclusions or capital exclusions, we add that in. So if you look at fiscal 15, while the existing tax base goes up 2.5%, property taxes overall are projected to go up 3.06%. And that's when you add in the new growth,
Yeah.
because the new growth isn't part of that calculation, and then any exempt debt.
So the 2.5% assumption excludes new growth.
It excludes new growth.
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kerry, with respect to new growth, you mentioned that the Emerald Place project is really coming to a close.
Yeah.
My understanding is much of that property is being leased and hasn't been sold. How does that impact the tax calculation for that particular property?
For commercial property, and anything that is leased is considered commercial property. There are 3 different valuation methods that are used, but typically for residential rental property, the value of that is based on the rent that is generated from the property. And the board asked, the Board of Selectmen asked the assessor for some additional information on that, and I think he provided that before, and I do need to follow up with him. But it's calculated different, because commercial property, you're looking at the income that is generated from the property. Now, I couldn't tell you without talking to him whether that's more or less. It's just calculated differently.
So if that property were eventually sold, the individual properties, it may or may not have an impact on the overall tax.
Correct. Yeah. Since the valuation of that is based on the rents that it brings in, if there is significant vacancy in the project, then that impacts the valuation of it as well. The assessor will use a standard vacancy rate in determining the value of the property, but the property owner then can challenge that. If the standard vacancy rate is 15%, and I'm just picking that number out. It's been a long time since I've been familiar with that. But if the standard is 15% and there's a 30% vacancy in that project, then the property owner has the ability to petition the Board of Assessors for an abatement, and that would be a basis for granting an abatement. So, I'm not sure with that particular project what the vacancy rate is over there. I don't believe it's very high, but that is something that could have a significant difference in the valuation of the property.
Carrie, has there been a challenge that you know of?
No.
I didn't think
No.
so. I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that.
Right.
But that is something that you typically see in a challenge on a commercial property is the vacancy rate.
Yep. And then one last question on that. the new growth assumption is down a bit and relatively flat, 150,000 in 15 and 16, going to 175 in 17, 18, 19. It seems to me that there are a number of potential projects. Would you consider this to be a very conservative estimate of new growth?
Well, I think it's conservative, but it's what we have seen when we don't have something else going on in town. This is what you would see generated just with, individual home renovations, people adding porches and swimming pools and that kind of thing. That's what you'd see from a community this size. So until we know that something else is moving, it's hard to bump that up.
Okay. Anyone else on the revenue? Okay.
So next on the expenditure assumptions, I've put together one forecast this year. Last year we had two different forecasts, and that was atypical. But we had, I think that was to accommodate some differing opinions, I guess. But this year there's one forecast. And I do think as I haven't projected a lot in terms of increases. There's one part-time position that's included in this forecast. There aren't any others. In the past, I have included a number of positions in different departments. I expect that through the budgeting process, departments will submit requests for additional positions, and those will be considered along with everything else. But I think what struck me this year in putting the forecast together is the fact that I don't see a big increase in revenues. We've done a lot to tighten our belt and to be more efficient. We've done a lot with health insurance, and we'll see in the current fiscal year and in fiscal 15 some real savings in health insurance, some real help. I don't expect that we're going to be able to produce anything like that for another couple of years, if we're even able to do that in a couple of years. We have a large school project before the voters being considered. We have lots of other capital needs. We have roads that need to be maintained. And I guess what struck me this year is the reality that we had an override. We had a lot that we included in that override, and it didn't get turned down by a small margin. And it could have been the timing, but I don't think so. I mean, I think the timing maybe is the reason why it was defeated so handily, but I don't think it would be easy to pass an override. So what struck me is trying to balance the capital needs that we have with the operating needs, and we're going to have to figure that out, work harder to figure that out, because we can't continue funding our capital budget with an estimate of $500,000 a year. We have fire trucks. We have one in 15. I don't think we have one in 16, but we have one every other year. And those trucks are generally in excess of what we spend on capital on an annual basis. We're not putting a significant amount of money towards our roads. And so there isn't any realistic way to say we're going to spend $500,000 on capital, and we're going to spend what we get in Chapter 90 from the state for roads and another $100,000. It's just, it's not going to work. So in terms of expenditure assumptions, I'm making the assumption that we're going to continue with our administrative and land use offices in Council on Aging on a 4-day per week schedule. We've been doing that for 2 years now, and people are used to it. They've making adjustments. And and it seems to be working okay. I'm assuming that we're going to meet our minimum spending requirement for the library and not any more than that, and that results in about a 2.5% increase. Maybe slightly more than that, but I've included 2.5%. And that will allow us to keep our library, to maintain certification. I've made an assumption that the Lunenburg Public Schools, that we would increase that budget by 3.5%. That would result in additional funding of $564,000. The reason that I chose 3.5% rather than 2.5% or 2% is because the school has particular expenses that can be extraordinary, such as special education costs. And also health insurance. The school funds its own health insurance. And while we made lots of changes in plan design, the biggest cost savings from the changes that we made are with our retiree plans, not with our active employees. And the school only provides health insurance to active employees. So the school is not going to see the same level of cost savings in health insurance that we'll see in the unclassified budget. I've also assumed that there would be a 3.5% increase in our Monty Tech assessment, that our enrollment there would be level. But again, Monty Tech, in addition to paying for health insurance, special education costs, they have any debt service associated with that school built into their assessment. So that is something additional. We also, in fiscal 2014, as a result of, and I'm just going to pull out a letter I have for reference. There was a change in minimum contribution for Monty Tech's assessment, and I'm not sure that this has been distributed to the Finance Committee yet. But as a result, Lunenburg's assessment and several of the communities that are members of Monty Tech, but Lunenburg's assessment in particular increased, or minimum contribution increased in fiscal 14 by $49,000. This is something that we were made aware of after the budget had been passed, and the Monty Tech School Committee decided that they were not going to look for that money from any of the communities in fiscal 14 because of the timing, but did put us on notice that they would be looking for that $49,000 from Lunenburg in fiscal 15. So I have included that in fiscal 15 in the forecast. I am hoping that by the time we get to the end of 14 that we'll be able to pay that, set that money aside out of 14 through underspending in some other area. It's far too early in the fiscal year to be able to determine that, but I'm hoping that we would be able to do that, because that's a big chunk of money to be coming up with. I'm not projecting any increase in either police, fire, or DPW, with the exception in DPW of roads, and some funding for roads, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Health insurance, right now I'm projecting a 6% increase for our active plans, active employee plans, and 4% for our retirees, and I'll go through that more in a few moments. Our retirement assessment, I did speak with the executive director at Worcester Regional Retirement this week, and it's very early for anybody to be talking about anything with fiscal 15, and he gave me our unofficial assessment for fiscal 15, which is an increase of $105,000. In January, Worcester Regional has its annual meeting where they go through their assessment calculation, and you get an understanding of why your assessment changed. I'm sure it has something to do with their most recent valuation, but until I'm able to go to that meeting, I can't tell you specifically why we would see an increase of that magnitude, but that is very significant. We've been seeing increases of about 9% per year, which is significant. Obviously, this is much, much, much larger than that.
I beg your pardon? What is the percentage?
That percent is, I think that's closer to 15%.
Thank you.
I mentioned that I have also included in the forecast increased spending for capital, which I'll go through, and then maintaining our stabilization fund at 5% of our operating budget, which requires an annual contribution of somewhere just under $50,000 per year. And again, I'm hoping that in each year we have free cash in at least that amount to be able to cover that. Next slide, please. So in total, these expenditure assumptions produce an annual increase of about 2.8% as opposed to about 2% in revenue. So the assumptions produce a deficit. I'm sure everybody was wondering, was it going to happen this year? But I think the deficits are much smaller than what we've seen in the past, so that is encouraging. But right now we're looking at about a deficit of about $550,000 in fiscal 2015, and we're talking about a budget that's in excess of $30 million right now. So just to give you a scale, but increasing over the life of the forecast to about $1.3 million. So far more manageable than what we have seen in the past. But again, there's very little increase in staffing, service levels outside of providing a better level of funding for capital, but still not what we need. Next slide. So health insurance, and I know this is going to be hard to see up on the screen, but I did provide a full page handout, which is hopefully easier to receive, to read. This projection that I make is for employees and retirees that are outside of Lunenburg Public Schools, because that's a line item in health insurance, is a line item in the school's budget. Obviously, we work with the same premiums. The budget for health insurance for the school is slightly higher than ours because they cover slightly more. Their enrollment is a little bit higher. But so together, health insurance, the employer contribution to health insurance for the town as a whole is close to $4 million. I'm projecting a budget of $1,647,000, which is less than what we've paid in the past. It's about $100,000 less in 15 as opposed to 14. And this is because of the significant savings that the town will achieve through the changes made specifically to the retiree health insurance plans. And this is the first year, 15 will be the first year that we have a full year of those savings in retiree plans, because the retiree plans run on a calendar year because everything is tied to Medicare now. So in 14 we only had half a year of savings, but we'll have a full year in 15. But overall, in this health insurance line item, I'm projecting that we're going to cover 260 people. 89% of those people we cover are retirees. So that's very significant. Our retiree health insurance is a significant portion of the budget. We have a current enrollment of between 245 and 255 members, and it fluctuates monthly because an employee or a retiree can have a qualifying event which makes him or her eligible for health insurance or not eligible for health insurance. and we have to build in a cushion. So there is some room for people coming on the plan that aren't on the plan in the event that we hired new employees. The one thing that I would like to mention is we have a retiree plan called MedX2, Blue Medicare RX, and I meant to put another slide in to compare what we had been paying for these plans. This MedX plan is a plan that if you are a retiree from the town of Lunenburg, but you don't live in this area, or you don't live in this area for a full year, you spend half your year in Florida or somewhere, or if you're like John Mayle and you winter here and you summer someplace colder. You need a health insurance plan that you can use whether you're here or you're out of state. So we have a very small number of employees that are part of this MedX2 plan. But this plan, which currently costs, the total premium on it is $287.80 per month. Or that's what's projected in 15. Now this is part of a plan, because if you're on one of these plans, you have Medicare Part B, which you pay for, and you have this Medicare supplement plan. This plan used to cost $700 a month. Not this exact plan. We had a MedX3 plan, which was essentially the same benefits. So I would expect to see some movement for people who that didn't used to be affordable. Because this plan we pay 50%. The other plans we pay 75%. So on top of it being more expensive, the town also made a lower contribution. So it may be that we'll see, as a result of these changes in pricing, that we'll see some people moving back and forth. But fortunately, those 3 retiree Medicare supplement plans, the cost to the town is not it's not huge, but I do expect that we'll see some movement there. Are there any questions on health insurance?
Would we be able to anticipate in the future that the teachers would begin to become more engaged in the reforms as well? And then within the school operating budget, there'd be some beneficial impact?
Well, we negotiate health insurance with all of the unions together at a coalition. So the teachers' union is part of that, and the teachers' union actually has been, I shouldn't say actually, they've been very instrumental in the changes that we've made, been very helpful in speaking to their membership. We essentially, the way that we bargain, each union gets a percentage of the vote based on their membership.
Right.
And retirees get 10%. So we can't make any change in health insurance without the support of the teachers' union. So all of the unions have been very supportive, and I would expect that everybody would continue to be supportive. And the changes that we have made, they're not just benefiting the town financially, they're benefiting employees and retirees financially in terms of what they're paying on a monthly basis. Our premiums this year across the board are less than they were in fiscal 13. So there was savings in monthly premiums, an opportunity to save in co-pays. There were also some co-pays added that we didn't have before, but for specific things that hopefully people don't have to make use of. But for doctor's visits, there's an opportunity to pay less in co-pays. So the changes have been mutually beneficial in health insurance.
And Carrie, to that point, I know these numbers don't include the school district, but are they on the same selection of plans?
We all use the same plans, and the school, if you had the school enrollment, it's very similar, where almost everybody is in the HMO plan.
Right.
We have very few people that are in the PPO plan.
Okay.
Yes. So then the next item I wanted to talk about are our roads. Here's an example of a residential road in a neighborhood that under our current funding structure, I almost want to say it will never get fixed. It's already failed. I mean, you can see it's completely failed, and really almost would never get fixed. So next slide. So our current pavement management plan calls for spending of about $1 million per year. We spend, well, I'll go through that in a minute. Deferred maintenance on the roads, it doesn't just impact residents that are riding on the roads, it impacts all of our equipment that's riding on the road. So our $600,000 fire truck that's going down these roads is being impacted, more heavily impacted than individual cars and smaller trucks. Our buses that go down these roads are being impacted, and you have to believe that when a bus company is bidding on transportation for Lunenburg Public Schools, it's taking into account the condition of the roads. I even was visited by our local postmaster a couple of years ago, who I think wanted to make sure I was aware that the roads in town were not in the best condition, and it was impacting their vehicles, and he wanted to know when I could fix the roads. So we had a nice conversation, and I thanked him for letting me know the roads were not up to the standards of the U.S. Postal Service. But you know, we don't always think about the impact on the equipment, and I think that's important. So I hope this doesn't come as any surprise, because I've mentioned it before, but we need to put more of our operating budget towards roads. And one way we can do that is by, over the next few years, when we start seeing a decrease in our non-exempt debt service, that we essentially transfer those dollars that are already built into our operating budget to our road budget. And that's one way to build up what we're spending on our roads. So in terms of, I just have a small spreadsheet here, state, the column that's identified as the state, this is the Chapter 90 funding. This is money that the state gives us on an annual basis for roads. We've, since fiscal 2012, have received, prior to that we received about $360,000 per year. We received an increase in fiscal 2012 up to $426,000. We've stayed around there. In the current year, we have an appropriation for 422, but I'm not sure we're going to receive all of that because of what's going on at the state level. But essentially, up until the current fiscal year, we weren't really putting any of our operating budget towards roads. We were able to put $107,000 in fiscal 14, and I'd like to continue to build that over the next several years. What I'm proposing in 15 is to bump that up to 125, up to 150 in 2016. And then in 2017, when we start seeing some of that non-exempt debt fall off, we would bump up to 250. And then in 18, we see another amount come off, and we would bump that up to $400,000 and hopefully maintain that. So then between what we receive from the state and what we put in locally, we're at around $800,000, which is what the DPW director has requested in capital on an annual basis. Now, he's looking for $800,000 locally. I mean, that, it would be wonderful if we could do that. I'm not sure how we make that next leap, but this would be an effort towards getting to something that is more reasonable annual expenditure for road maintenance. Next slide, please. And then capital, this is another handout that you have. The capital committee,
This is back on the roads still, I think. What you've assumed there is we're not going to have any new non-exempt debt?
well, I guess you could characterize it that way. That, no, I'm not.
What was the cause of the current non-exempt debt, and why will that not recur?
Well,
There's some reason that we have a bunch of non-exempt debt today. I don't know what they all are. All the reasons are.
yeah, we have the track, the turf, the turf field. That's probably the largest that we have. We have some other. I'd have to go back. It's old. It's before 2007. So I'm sure it's associated with capital. The capital planning process.
What about the DPW facility? Isn't that
That's true.
That's
I'm sorry.
non-exempt
The
debt?
DPW
That's
facility.
right.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Yep. Thank you. So we don't expect that to recur. Okay, I understand.
I think, John, just before I leave that, I think, we have to have a serious discussion about that, because we can't, when we get into capital, we can't maintain what we have. We have buildings that need improvements. We have big ticket items. So, I'm not saying it won't recur, but based on the conversations I've had with the Finance Committee, the Capital Planning Committee, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in issuing any debt for capital, and I don't know how realistic that is. But I guess based on the conversations I've had over the last several years, I'm not sure I'm going to make a whole lot of progress, and we need to do something with the roads.
Yeah. I concur wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. Carry the entire 1.3 million then over the course of the next 5 years in this projection or trend would, for the pavement management system, local funding of the pavement management system would come from retired non-exempt debt. Is that correct?
Well, not entirely, because it's only the increase. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah, I think,
So the increase over the 100,000 plus for this year would come, but that would be from the entire could be funded from retired non-exempt debt over that period of time?
the increase over 150,000.
150.
Yeah, because the increase in 15 up to 125 and then up to 150 in 16 is not coming from the retirement of exempt debt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So then next, capital. The Capital Planning Committee has been working for the last couple of months reviewing all of the capital requests that were submitted for consideration. There were 23 items that were submitted for fiscal 2015 for capital. In past years, the estimate in the forecast has been $500,000 for capital. And we've spent about that or a little bit more, even though we've had requests significantly in excess of that. This document is I guess the final draft recommendation of the Capital Committee. We'll be meeting next week to go through this. but I have to commend the capital committee for the work that was done this year, because they put they always put in a lot of effort, but this year they prioritized every single item that was submitted. They've created 3 different categories, A, B, and C. You know, I can't tell you a whole lot about this now because I haven't met with them yet, but I wanted to put this in to illustrate the fact that I'm proposing in the forecast of funding of $750,000 is still not going to meet what the capital committee has identified as priority A. And the big reason is because one of the high priorities is one of the fire trucks. And we are going to see requests for fire truck replacement probably every other year for the next several years. And there are many items here that, I mean, everything is important. We have everything from departmental equipment, technology, maintenance at buildings.
Asbestos removal.
Asbestos removal, if you can imagine, in 2013, we're talking about asbestos removal in schools.
That's a capital item?
138,000.
It's number one. It's number one on the list.
I guess I'm just surprised it's a capital item.
Well, it's capital because we define capital as anything over $10,000. So even with an increase to $750,000, and I'm not 100% sure that we can do that because we have a $500,000 plus deficit. You know, we're still not getting through priority A, the priority A list. And capital in future years is at least this amount, $1.4 million, if not more. So the next. So this is the last slide. The kind of, you know, what are the next steps? I certainly would be happy to talk to either the Finance Committee or the Board of Selectmen about assumptions. It's easy enough to model a different set of assumptions or to change that, and if you're interested, we certainly can do that. On an internal basis, we're still looking at cost savings measures and some revenues that we might be able to put into place for fiscal 15. Specifically, I've been working with the police chief, and we're looking at implementing towing. We're looking at the police department on an annual basis contracts with towing companies for towing that the police require. And in other communities, those towing companies will pay the community a certain percentage of the towing fee or a flat amount of the towing fee that comes back to the town. And significant revenue can be generated even in a community like this. So we're looking at implementing that. And for anybody who may be concerned about that, it is something that is legal to do. I'm very familiar with it. The town of Chelmsford, where I worked previously, this is something that we did. It's something that's been approved by the Attorney General's office and can bring in a significant amount of revenue. So that's something we're looking to do here. We're also looking at our ambulance fees. The fire chief has raised a concern that our ambulance fees are not covering the cost of providing the service, so I've asked him to put a proposal together. Ambulance fees are something that the Board of Selectmen can review and approve, so we will be looking at that. We are looking at 2 different regional opportunities for fiscal 15, both regional lockup and regional animal control. I'm hopeful in the current fiscal year that we will obtain a grant from MRPC to study regional animal control. I've talked to them. They are willing to approve a grant for that. And we would be looking at potentially hosting that for several communities in the area. And then we begin the review of the fiscal 15 budget process. I have a staff meeting on Tuesday next week. We are going to follow the same process that we did last year, where I give each of the departments a target to work from, and then they can identify anything that they want above target. But this process worked much better. It was much more efficient, appreciated by the departments when they knew what their target was. And the target, while it doesn't necessarily produce a balanced budget, it gets us close enough to where I feel like I can work with that. So that's what we will be doing. My recommendation is due to you on February 15th. You probably will see it closer to the beginning of February because I'm taking a vacation, believe it or not. And then both the Selectmen and the Finance Committee review the budget in March and April. You have all of the departments come in and make the presentations. And then really by mid-April, you have to finalize your recommendation. And then we go to town meeting. The annual town meeting this year is on May 3rd of 2014. That is the end of my presentation.
Carrie, I didn't see anything in your assumptions with respect to the school building project. I would imagine it would show up both on the revenue side and on the expense side. Did expect to see an assumption, however.
In terms of debt service?
No, just the expectation that there will be a project and then it would be funded and likely to be in fiscal 17.
Okay. I certainly can add that in there. I guess I just was waiting until after town meeting and the vote. But that certainly can be included and should be in the event that the authorization is obtained.
Other questions for Carrie?
With the potential of interest rates rising over the next few years, do you feel like there's any exposure within our current debt to the budget and to your assumptions? Or is everything that's currently, in our debt service in a fixed interest rate?
All of our debt service has fixed interest rates, and we have the opportunity to refinance if conditions are right. We have a financial advisor that we work with who looks at all of our debt and advises the treasurer when it looks like there's an opportunity to refinance.
I'd like to open it up to the public, but before I do, just a couple of comments. First of all, congratulations on a two-step increase in the bond rating. That's fantastic. That's great news for the town, particularly with the school building project on the horizon. That goes a long way towards securing the best interest rate that we can possibly get for the town. And secondly, thank you for pulling all this information together. I know you're obligated to do it, but I also know it's a lot of work, and I want you to know that we appreciate the work that you put into this. It's always clear, and everything can be explained. We may not agree with it, but we at least have the assumptions that back up the numbers, and everything ties out. So thank you for that. I'd like to open it up. Anyone from the public?
I want to thank Town Manager as well. As the Chair noted, a lot of work, a lot of detail, a lot of information. I think we got to take a breath on this and step back because tomorrow the articles in the paper are going to be Town Manager projects massive deficit. Town Manager projects 5-year deficit for Town of Lunenburg. Town Manager always projects a deficit. at this time. This time of year, as we're looking ahead, starting to look at next year's budget, we're starting from a negative number. Incredibly small deficit. Normally it's over $1 million. We're looking at the next year. If we weren't projecting a deficit, I would worry that there was a problem with the formulas in the spreadsheet. So just want people to kind of understand it's normal process. You know, as we start looking at the actual budget, of course, we're going to make hard decisions. We're going to decide on what we should do, what we could be doing, versus what we can afford to do. And that's our normal process. We'll continue, as the town manager pointed out, looking for ways to be more efficient, save more money, et cetera. So, again, don't be worried that there's a deficit today. I mean, be aware that there's other things we could be doing with the money, but we're going to do what we have, what we can with what we have. So, I appreciate that. I appreciate the process that you guys are going to go through to get us through that as well. So, also just want to point out, of course, people are also going to say, or leap to the conclusion that, well, if we're projecting a deficit, how can we be talking about spending $36 million on a middle school, high school project? Well, simply, that project should have go forward. The funding is not in this budget. The funding comes from outside the budget in the debt exclusion. So, although there'll be some impact as we look ahead at the forecast, the reality is it's not going to impact this document very much at all. It's all outside of 2.5, it's all outside of this operating budget. So there's two different discussions, two different commitments, two different things we need to look at. So they're not tied together. Just want to remind folks of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. And I'd just like to remind folks that in her opening remarks, Kerry did talk about the fact that she's obliged to come up with a balanced budget. So in the forecast, it may look like a deficit, but by the time we get to February 15th or perhaps the week before, we will have a balanced budget. Anyone else from the public? Anyone else from the committee? Kerry, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay. We will move on to the rest of our agenda. We have minutes from 2 meetings. We actually had a field trip on September 26th, but we had posted for a meeting. We had posted an agenda, so Terry was good enough to put together some minutes from 9/26. Everyone had a chance to review them?
Yes.
Okay, any discussion? Motion? Thank you.
Second?
Any discussion? Those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed?
I abstain,
Thank you.
not in attendance.
Yep.
You were nearby.
Brian was somewhere on Barnum Road, I think,
Jackson Road, I think it was.
Jackson Road.
One of those.
We also have minutes from our meeting of 11/14. Has everyone had a chance to review those?
Yes.
Move that we approve the minutes of 11:14.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? None. Thank you.
Great.
Committee reports. Steve?
Capital planning, we pretty much finished off our prioritization yesterday. We'll be meeting with the town manager next Wednesday, and at that point, I think we'll have finalized this year's capital planning prioritization. Building reuse, we presented to the selectmen last Tuesday, and at this point, we are awaiting any further requirements, but I don't know if who in the group has had the opportunity to see the presentation. But the gist of the recommendation, subject to the authorization of the new school, would be looking at the Passio School, the Brooks House, the Ritter, as possible requests for proposal sales of the properties, and the intent to consolidate as much of town government as possible in a renovated this town hall. we'd be able to consolidate most of the town government here, and then look at what we could possibly gain through an RFP process for the other 3 buildings mentioned.
I did look in on the presentation to the select board, and I think the committee did a great job. The recommendations seem sound, actionable, and in the best interest of the town. So thank you for your participation on that committee. And I understand Mr. Toll was the chair. Thanks, Jamie.
It was a great process, it really was.
Yeah. Good. Brian.
I attended the Library Board of Trustees meeting on November 21st. The typical updates that you'd get, they are about 33% spent into the year, which is exactly where they were expected to be. The Friends have paid for the cleaning of windows inside and out, so some of the activities at the building are being paid for outside of our budget. New power assist door has been installed. The DPW, they mentioned that DPW has a new system that helps track the regular maintenance projects. I think that's a great idea. Otherwise, it's going to be on back of somebody's head. It doesn't really work that way. If it's on a computer, great. So they're very happy with the maintenance they've been getting from the DPW and the support they've been getting from the DPW. They are investigating a new way to handle the computers down there. It would be something that would require a virtual desktop. That way, each one of the individual computers there could not be reprogrammed by somebody, which happens occasionally. They wouldn't be broken by somebody. They would be maintained by the company that provides it. It's a potential cost savings and a potential savings in the amount of support that would be required. I don't know if they've yet had a conversation with Carrie. I know there were a couple of meetings scheduled that weren't able to be held, but I think it's a great idea if it'll work. It'll save us a lot of money, and it'll save us a lot of resources, IT resources.
Great. Okay. Jason's not here. Karen?
Council on Aging, I was not able to make this past Tuesday's meeting, so I'm not sure what's going on that front. What else? Agricultural Commission doesn't meet again until next week, but they are working on their right to farm bill that they will hope to bring in front of the town. I don't think it's coming up in January. I think it's coming up hopefully in May. And Monty Tech, I heard from Barbara Reynolds, the Lunenburg rep for Monty Tech, and she said their library was about to open, and she had nothing else to report on that front.
Okay. Thank you. School committee met last Wednesday, and they started their budget review. The good news on the technology front, there's an overall reduction in the budget recommendation for the schools. However, some of the expenses were moved into capital. I saw them relatively low on the list. That might be somewhat concerning. But the technology director has done a good job of tightening the budget for schools technology. The 3 principals all talked about needing to restore their funding for school supplies to what the prior years have been. They went through some fairly substantial cuts last year, and they're looking to restore. Largely in the area of books, textbooks, magazines, periodicals. It was pretty universal across the board for supplies. They also talked about restoring some positions at the primary school, a tutor for in-classroom support. Middle school, same thing. They were down 2 tutor positions. They're now down 1. Also hoping to restore a technology position that was moved to the high school. And the high school is looking to add a licensed social worker. So they had a discussion about the budget. They recognize that it's due at the end of the calendar year, and they're working to complete that work. They also talked briefly about the building reuse recommendations. The one item they have is that at their next meeting, they're going to discuss the impact of possibly having to bring TCP back online if the project is not approved. Karen, you were at that meeting. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I don't. I mean, I think you covered pretty much everything.
Okay. And for the school building committee, we are preparing for town meeting as we speak. We worked late into the evening last night trying to bring our presentation together. We've had a couple of public forums now. We had two on December 5th. We had one in the afternoon and another one in the evening. They were sparsely attended, but the few people that came had good questions for us, and we think that's informative in terms of preparing our presentation. We really want to try and answer as many questions as we can in our presentation, and have a good story to tell about how important this is for the town and how we've done everything we can to select the right project at the right cost. So that's it. Terry?
I have nothing to report.
Okay. And John?
DPW, I have identified two possible sources for grants for the Mutco signage project, but I have nothing specific enough to report on yet. The Public Access Committee postponed their November meeting until December 2nd. Unfortunately, it was a time that I could not attend. I don't know if they'll have a December meeting. The January meeting will give me their 3-month update on expenditures versus revenue, so I'll report back then.
Okay. Okay. Looks like Kerry is still here. I don't know if she has any further updates for us. I did reserve a spot on the agenda for her. Why don't we move on? John had.
She's right here.
She is coming in. Okay.
May or may not have updates.
Kerry, I'm not sure if you have.
No, I heard.
Yes.
To go walk around the building for a minute. Yes.
You can say no, there's no updates.
Oh, updates. I don't think so. How about questions?
Could I ask a question? On the Chapter 90 funding, initially we were given a number of $600,000,
Yes,
and then we've
That-
only gotten 4.
422.
Has there been any other discussion about the remaining 200,000?
I don't know if there's been any discussion. I don't think that we will see any of that. I don't think it will be funded.
This year
This
or in the
year.
future? Do you get a sense that because that could be a nice upside on the pavement plan in the upcoming years if that number could go to the 600?
I mean, we're going to have a change, probably a pretty big change at the state level shortly, so I don't expect to see anything this year, and it'd be hard to say. I mean, a lot of that, there was a lot involved in how we were going to get that money. One thing that I could update on roads, I just heard yesterday from our engineer that our Summer Street project is at 25% design and has been submitted to the state for review and approval. The 25% design is significant in the sense that you can't get on the TIP, which is the Transportation Improvement Program, until you're at 25% design, but we actually got on before 25% design. But it's still a milestone in the design of the project.
Was that 217? Is that when was the actual work looking to be done?
Yeah, 2017. Everything's 2017.
Thank you.
May I have a question for just clarification? It's on this sheet that you pointed out to us,
Yeah.
but for a previous question I had, it seems like it looks like the debt exclusion line is the only line that is lower in 2019 under the projection
Yeah.
than it was in, say, 2015, the initial. Just for my clarification, the debt exclusion line only refers to money that is used for paying long-term capital projects, right?
That's for any long-term debt associated with a debt exemption.
Okay,
So we raise whatever we need to pay the associated debt service in that year, and as time goes on, that is reduced as a result of the reduction in the principal.
and that reduction would not affect the revenue that we use for operating expenses, is that correct?
It does not,
Okay.
right?
So therefore, the actual, and that reduction is part of the 2.8% average growth rate that you've projected, right?
Well, that's part of the 2%, the
I'm
revenue,
sorry,
2%
that's
for
correct,
revenue.
2%.
Yeah,
Okay. So therefore, the growth rate for revenue we can apply to operating expenses may be slightly higher than the 2%.
yes,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure
yeah. So that's the downside of looking at, a percentage of what,
yeah.
right?
yeah.
You have to be careful, you're looking at a percentage of what.
Wanted to make sure I understood what the numbers were telling me. Thanks, Carrie.
Anything else for Kerry? Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, John. Did everyone get John's draft for capital policy?
Yes.
John, you want to just give us a little bit of background on how you
Sure.
pulled this together?
Yeah.
What, just as we did with the previous policy on stabilization funds, we started with what we had in town. We then went to the Massachusetts general laws to see what they had to say with respect to the capital projects. And we went to the Massachusetts DOR, Division of Local Services, Municipal Glossary, to tighten, to make sure that the way we talk about capital projects is defined the way that the DOR, Division of Local Service, would have us define them. And the terms we use are consistent with that. Having put that in place, I then went to the website for the capital plan committee website, and rearranged the website so it was a little more coherent, painted a little more coherent picture of a plan statement, revising some of the text on the website, but trying to make sure that that this is true to the meaning of the website, although it ties better with the terms and definitions that is on the state. And so what you have is here is a very rough draft of this. And I also, just one more thing, because this is such a rough draft, I haven't yet tied the terms or any of the other things to the glossary as I did with the stabilization fund. So that's to be done the next week or two.
Okay.
So I'm looking for comments. Make it better.
I do have just one question, whether or not it would make sense at this point. Since roads aren't spelled out separately, but we do have a separate road management, pavement management plan, would it make sense to somehow either note it or have a sub-policy regarding the pavement plan or the road management plan?
I'm open to that. Good suggestion. Would the pavement management, we can spell this out specifically. Would anything in the capital plan policy statement affect the pavement management plan differently than other capital projects? I don't know.
And the road pavement project is really being handled through the operating budget, not through the capital plan.
Okay.
So it really wouldn't really cross paths, I believe.
Good point. That leads to another question, which goes beyond the capital project. As you recall, 3 weeks ago, we had our meeting. We talked about, we went from capital projects to free cash. And at free cash, we started to talk about a sequence of uses for free cash. Number one would be put free cash into the stabilization account, as Kerry mentioned earlier in this meeting. But I think the second one was actually earmarking it for a DPW for road maintenance. Fact is, it makes sense to me. However, the fact is that the free cash, and we know we're getting sort of further afield, free cash is considered non-recurring revenue. And the DOR, although they don't explicitly say this, say don't do it, they say they do warn against applying any non-recurring revenue source to operating expenses. But I can understand that the road maintenance is a little different kettle of fish because it can be modified from year to year depending on availability of funds.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of a hybrid, right?
Yes.
We're always going to have a need to maintain the roads, and we're never going to have enough money to do it.
Exactly.
So in the case where we do have some extra money in the form of free cash, that would be a good way to expend it.
Yeah.
Right,
And to your point, and consistent with what Kerry presented this evening, we do need to maintain at least a 5%.
Yeah, that's the number one.
That's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, what we talked about last time was any infrastructure improvements, including the pavement management plan.
Didn't we also reference capital projects in that as well, or capital
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, the capital and the infrastructure are almost 2A and 2B,
Right.
so,
Right.
yeah.
As long as there are capital and infrastructure improvements that do not carry with them some sort of continuing expenses.
Right.
After the fiscal year in which we have the free cash in excess of what we need to replenish the stabilization fund.
Right.
And maybe that's the way we can sort of first rough draft, if we could put it that way in the policy, if you'd like.
Yeah, so, kind of getting back to this,
Yeah.
and I think Kerry even referenced it in her presentation. We've talked about stabilization fund. We've got a pretty good draft of that policy, along with an application of the policy. We have this first draft of the capital. We talked a little bit about free cash, and then the fourth component would be the borrowing.
Yep.
So we've got a bit more work to do. Focusing on the capital for a minute, what I'd like to see is a reference to the process that you just went through, Steve, with the capital planning committee, where there's a prioritization of all the current items as well as a longer term. I think you put a 5-year plan together for
There is
each
5
department,
year-
do you not?
There is,
Yep.
yes.
So I'd like to see that referenced in the policy.
Okay.
That will, every year we'll have a capital planning committee, we'll convene them in advance of the budget. We'll have them construct both a 5-year plan and a prioritized list of one-year recommendations.
John, I'd be happy to either sit down with you between now and our next meeting or get on the phone with you and we can go through that together.
I'd be delighted.
All right.
And I'm glad that we have this kind of conversation, because I had an internal debate whether that was beyond the scope of the project to put a policy together. It is not.
No, I don't think it is. In fact, I think all the work that you have here is supportive of that process. So that I don't see any need to change anything that you've done, just to add to it with the role of the committee and the process that they go through.
Why don't we get together sometime between now and, are you free sometime between now and next, say, Tuesday?
Yeah.
Good.
We'll figure a day. We'll talk offline and we'll
Great.
figure a time and a
Thanks.
day.
Great. Any other feedback for John?
Oh, one other thing here. I did not put down here, because I wanted this to be a discussion point for us. Do we want to, in the policy, put a debt service limit? That is, should we make sure that the debt service it does not exceed 10% of town revenue, tax revenue, or 15% or 5%? Remember, the MGO doesn't really give us any guidance, because they tie it to the equalized valuation of the town,
Right,
which we never get to.
I would suggest that that's the fourth
Right.
topic, the borrowing.
Oh, okay,
And
so
any
that's-
debt
yeah.
service associated with the borrowing would be part of that policy.
Well, just, I would say that because it clearly does affect the capital decisions, I think we might want to, after we do the fourth topic, swing back to the capital policy and have a reference there to the debt, to the borrowing, so that people reading this document can say there's a link here that's germane.
I think that's absolutely appropriate. Yep. And I think, to be candid, I think we need to take up the matter of borrowing for certain capital items. You know, we talked about the fire trucks this evening. Those are big ticket items. And to pay for those solely out of operating funds is a challenge.
We discussed that as
I-
well
Yeah.
in our meeting, because if you looked at that, that list, if you did do something to finance the fire engine, you could do virtually everything in Category A and several things in Category B, and really deal with the things that truly need to be dealt with this year. So, there are some high-ticket items that tend to skew everything else that I think on a one-off basis, I don't think it should be commonplace. And this is I'm giving you my opinion. I don't think it should be commonplace, but I think there are times where it's going to be warranted and necessary, or else we're not going to be able to do several other very important things along the way.
Mr. Matthews, yes.
What we used to do when I was in capital planning was we would, informally, it was like a $100,000 limit. So if we need a new plow truck, sander and all that, it's gonna cost 120 grand. We would consider that from borrowing. So I think it would help if you guys could develop some kind of guidance for when borrowing would occur. I think the town manager can impact that a lot, obviously, but, yeah, one fire truck kills you. It's your whole budget.
Right.
I think consistently, we've probably borrowed for every fire truck we own. But we got to be careful, of course, because, of course, we've got new exempt debt coming on, significant potentially, so we've got to watch our overall debt limits, but, as John indicated, but there's a certain amount we can carry. The trade-off is you're now committing those dollars for the next, however, 5 to 10 years, whatever your term is.
Right.
Automatically, you got to pay those. But also, you're working against inflation. Because one thing I also learned in capital planning, we put some stuff off so long. A paving project at Turkey Hill was going to cost whatever, 20 grand. By the time we got to it, it cost 45. So there's, give and take there that need to be kind of sorted out. So I think we all use the guidance.
It can be a slippery slope, though. I think you want to be very judicious of when you do it. I think it really needs to be on an exception basis, or else the next thing you know, every year you're financing $500,000, $600,000, and down the road you end up with $3, $4, $5 million in debt, which I would be strongly against. But I do think there are occasions where it's warranted.
Right. I think, historically, we've all been very judicious in when we borrowed for anything, and we need to continue that. We need to be cautious, but,
Yeah.
kind of formalize that would probably help.
Thanks for your input. And in our earlier conversation, Brian asked a question about the non-excluded debt, and do we see any on the horizon? And the answer was no. But that doesn't mean it couldn't change.
Yeah.
And I guess I agree with John. It would be good to have some guidance in terms of how much non-excluded debt we're willing to take on at any time. I would be careful about taking money that could potentially go to the roads and earmarking that elsewhere without understanding the urgency and priority of dealing with the roads. But also, fire protection for the town is incredibly important too. So, it's
As I
some,
understand,
tough trade-offs.
As I understand non-excluded debt, forgive me for talking over somebody, that comes from the operating expense, right? So that again is a zero, well, it could be a zero-sum game depending on what the debt is used for to buy. But that means it really could crowd out some continuing budget item, right?
That's
So
right.
you have to be extremely careful. So I think when we do assign limits to that, I think the limit should be rather small. Like tiny.
In terms of how much non-excluded debt we're
Yeah.
willing to
Yeah.
take on. And I would generally agree with that, but I would also agree with Mr. Matthews that there may be room to set a threshold at which point we would consider taking on debt for
Yeah.
one-time capital items, one-time recurring capital items.
One of the gates we may want to set in place is that non-excluded debt, we look maybe more favorably at if it was for equipment that then lowered operating expenses.
If that were possible, that would be
Yeah.
great. That would be a win-win.
So,
I would also,
Any?
well,
Okay. We'd love to.
yeah, I'm not certain, but I do know that organizations do get rid of some of their overhead, with automation.
I still also would like to, at some point down the road, revisit the whole notion of creating, at some point, instead of, like not ruling it out of the stabilization fund policy to, if at some point it becomes feasible to do it, to create a capital stabilization fund for capital items, in addition to if we ever reach a point where we can fund that so that we don't have to fund debt instead. But I could see that not happening now, but I would just not want to rule it out of the stabilization fund policy that we may want to pursue that at some point. Going back to that, I'm sorry.
Right, and that's a great point, and that's well within the draft of the policy we have where you can have general stabilization funds or designated stabilization funds. The one criterion being that if you designate a purpose for the stabilization fund, you need 2/3 vote to change that or to take the money out, as the case may be.
What is the time, I beg your pardon,
No,
Steve.
it's okay.
What is the time period that we should get this wrapped up so we can present it to the Board of Selectmen? So I know we'll be quite busy sometime fairly soon.
Yeah, we had talked last time that the ideal would be to have this wrapped up before we get too far into the budget season, which implies we've got a couple of meetings in January.
Yeah, that's it. So the end of January would be, okay, good, great. One more clarification here. When Carrie made her presentation, she got to a slide called Financial Policies. Financial Management Policies and Objectives adopted by the Board of Selectmen July 2004. My first reaction was that I was the victim of some large cosmic joke. It was already done, and you were trying to figure out when I was going to tumble on that conclusion. If so, you're doing a great job of leading me along. If not, if there is in fact a financial policy statement, where is it? I'd like these to guide me.
I can provide some insight there, and Kerry, please chime in if I'm off track. The document that Kerry refers to is about 2 paragraphs, 2 very brief paragraphs. I'm sure I have that, and I'd be happy to send it along to you. It's a very brief policy statement, and that's really what has spawned this activity that we're taking on now. We felt they need to be more robust, shall we say.
That's really. Thanks.
I think it's actually somewhere in your,
Kerry?
I think,
Just a couple of paragraphs on it.
I think it was handed out at one point. It's probably somewhere in your pile of research.
Yeah.
Well, it's only 2 paragraphs long. It's easy to see why I would
Yeah.
overlook it.
Okay. Okay, anything else on that for tonight? Budget opportunities? Any new budget opportunities?
Could I make a suggestion that possibly for one of our meetings in January is that we have a follow-up, hopefully with the town manager in attendance, that we could just talk about the 5-year forecast. And at the same time, maybe we can incorporate budget opportunities into that same discussion, or even if it's 2 separate things, but just some time for us all to read through this, really kind of dig into it, and then just have a general 15-minute, half-an-hour discussion of it. I also think budget opportunities that could come from that might be worth discussing at the next meeting as well.
Okay, well, we can certainly do that. I think we need to understand what the purpose of the forecast is, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a projection based on assumptions.
Right.
If you're asking to have an opportunity to digest the assumptions and have
Yes.
further dialogue around them?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then beyond that, and maybe it's a separate item, but just then I think it would be a good time. I just think that the budget opportunities is an area that we need to look at, not from a short-term standpoint, but really from a long-term standpoint. And are there some other initiatives? You look at the building reuse, for example, this year. That was a way to potentially consolidate buildings, reduce operating expenses, and create some efficiencies. And I guess the challenge for all of us, not just the Finance Committee, but the selectmen, the town manager, is what are the next 2 or 3 of those that we could be looking at over the next 5 or 10 years? And they're never a 2-minute thing. They're always a several-year project. And we should have a series of those initiatives going on an ongoing basis, which would be favorable to the 5-year forecast.
And might extend the assumptions.
Correct. I mean, the best example is the regional dispatch. That took a long time to do. It not only created some efficiencies, but it also allowed us to elude a lot of additional costs that were going to come with that. There's no reason why we can't be thinking about what are the next 2 or 3 things that we do. We talked about sale of town properties, like West Street and those kinds of things about a year ago. What are the next 2 or 3 things that we could be thinking about as a town?
Right.
To try to create some additional efficiencies, which in turn would allow us to spend money on other things that we'd really like to spend money on, like pavement management and other things like that.
Kerry, I guess I do have one more item for you then. And maybe it's part of the future agenda items. I know in the past you've outlined a schedule for the budget process.
Yep.
Perhaps for our first meeting in January? Yeah, we've got one more meeting in December. Is it possible that we could have a draft schedule for
Yeah.
our first meeting in January?
Do you want me to plan out when you would meet with the departments then? Not just the meeting dates, but who you would meet with when? Sketch
Ideally,
that out. Okay.
ideally, if you could.
Yeah.
And also, if you're having a vacation, we want to respect that. Maybe that's a meeting for us to work on our policies. And that is something we could work into
Yeah.
the schedule.
Yeah.
But if you have a projected date where you would make your presentation, and then we'd have to look at the exact dates on the calendar leading up to May 3rd,
Right.
backing up to getting the warrant out and all of that.
Yeah, okay. We go through this every year about whether or not we have the presentation, the school vacation week,
Right.
or not, so.
Is that your vacation week?
No, mine is the week before. I'm not going, I'm not going on school vacation week,
You can come with us
so.
for vacation week.
So school vacation is the week of February 17th, is that right?
Yeah.
And we would be scheduled to meet on the 13th, that's the week you're away. Should we back our meeting up to the 6th?
To have the presentation of the budget?
Or we could have the presentation,
I mean, I think we can tentatively put that down, that, the trouble I run into in finalizing the budget, even on the 15th, is our health insurance renewal. I'm fighting to get the health insurance renewal for then. And, last year, we didn't even have a consensus revenue from the state. So it's not that it can't be done, it's just how realistic is it. The earlier it's done, that's the only thing. And I hate to continually change the document. I think it's worked well in the past that there have been relatively few changes to the document once it's issued. So, we could try for the 8th, if that's the date, and see how it goes.
That would
The
be the-
6th.
that
The
would be
8th
the
is when I'm-
6th.
yeah. Because otherwise, then it's really at the end of the month if you're going to avoid the school vacation week, which is late.
right? So if you could propose a calendar, including the presentation date.
Yeah.
And if we need to be flexible in terms of moving some of our meetings around, we do that every budget season. I think I've alerted the committee that we'll probably meet every Thursday during the month of March. And if we need to be flexible during the month of February, we can do that as well.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you. Okay. We do have a meeting scheduled for next week. Again, it's our public hearing of the special town meeting warrant. It'll be here, 7 o'clock, and it will be televised. After that, we have special town meeting on January 7th. We're scheduled to meet on January 9th, and then the special ballot will be on Saturday, January 11th. Okay?
Do we have time on the January 9th meeting to discuss fiscal policies?
I believe we will. We will have already had a special town meeting. If it passes by 2/3, then it goes to the ballot. If it doesn't get a 2/3 vote at special town meeting, then there won't be a ballot. But either way, that issue should be put to rest. at that time.
I could, at the January 9th meeting, have the free cash section addressed, as well as the first draft of the borrowing section.
Okay.
So I want to be able to do that.
That'd be great. That'd be fantastic.
Can we leave
Just
future
gotta pull
budget,
all the windows.
the budget opportunities on for one of our next regularly scheduled?
It's always on.
It's always on, okay.
Yeah, that's a standing
I figured that
item.
it was, but I just wanted to make sure. I'm too tired to even go there tonight.
Okay. Anything else for this evening?
I move that we adjourn.
I second.
Any discussion? Those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
You guys can